Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the KDPG Sunday Edition. I'm Ken Rice. We're being seen this morning at a special time because of March Madness NCAA basketball programming on CBS. Good to have you with us. It has been a bizarre mystery that's baffled investigators around the world. The odyssey of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. Back in 1961, renowned science fiction writer Rod Serling wrote an unforgettable episode of his Twilight Zone series on CBS, The Odyssey of Flight 33. About a jetliner that continues flying but never reaches its destination. The Odyssey of Malaysia Flight 370 is, of course, not fiction. The desperation of families waiting to learn the fate of this Boeing 777 airliner has been heart-wrenching, and as we recorded this broadcast, there were no concrete answers still as to what happened. Correspondent Craig Boswell has more on the broadening investigation.
CBS News has learned investigators believe Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 may have flown for an unknown period after it lost contact because the Boeing 777 continued to transmit signals about its engines to satellites. Neither Malaysian officials nor Boeing apparently downlinked that data, but sources say it's possible the jet flew for hours towards the Indian Ocean. The search has expanded westward, with the USS Kidd, a Navy destroyer assisting off Malaysia's east coast, now heading in that direction. Investigators are digging deeper into the radar signal the Malaysian military picked up, indicating the plane may have turned left.
They're beginning to understand at least where the aircraft did turn around.
Crews near the original flight path trying to find the objects in Chinese satellite photos turned up nothing.
We have contacted the Chinese embassy, who notified us this afternoon that the images were released by mistake and did not show any debris from MH370.
At the Kuala Lumpur airport, where the flight departed early Saturday, Malaysia Airlines is maintaining a regular schedule.
To me, this is a one-off incident.
Craig Boswell for CBS News, Washington.
This morning, what might have happened on board Flight 370 before its disappearance? And as the investigation into this strange incident continues, what about the plight of the passengers and crew and the legal rights they might have? A little later in the broadcast, attorney John Gismondi will join us. But now, our guest for this segment, Dr. Peter Gall, visiting professor of aerospace engineering at West Virginia University. He's a former NASA engineer, former U.S. Airways pilot with 16,000 hours of flying experience. Also with us, Pittsburgh attorney Dennis Unkovic, partner in the law firm of Meyer, Unkovic and Scott. He frequently flies back and forth to Asia. Just this week, returned to Pittsburgh from Japan aboard a Boeing 777. David Tribbin is away this week. John Allison, associate editor of the Post-Gazette, joins us. John, always good to have you here. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for being with us. Thank you. I think, obviously this is a huge human tragedy. 239 people on board presumed lost. But I think what's unnerving to the rest of the world is the idea that in this day and age, when we're so connected, we have all this technology from the sky, from the ground, that a modern jetliner could vanish, at least for 8 days, as it stands, as we speak today. With all of your aerospace expertise, does that baffle you as well?
In a way, it's very surprising, but there are a certain number of radios and ways to communicate from a jet aircraft to the ground, and all those methods can be disabled or, quote, turned off.
And I think with those of us who aren't intimately familiar with aviation as you are, I think a lot of us have been surprised to learn how many communication streams are coming from the typical jetliner. So much more than, the VHF radio that the crew uses to communicate with ground control. From what you've heard, what about the communication links is the most surprising? Is the furthest thing from that you would ever expect to happen?
Well, typically we use VHF radio for communications. We have 1, 2, sometimes 3 radios, or a primary with several backups. And that's for basically the communication between the pilots and the controllers. The second thing all airplanes have is what's called a transponder. Now, what the transponder does is it allows the aircraft to be seen on the radar screen. If you do not have a transponder, you will just show up as a target with no identification. They basically will not know what they're looking at. It could be a flock of birds even. So in order to positively identify and locate the aircraft at all times, air traffic control monitors you through the use of a transponder.
I just have to ask a question a lot of people have asked. why would a pilot be able to turn off a transponder?
That is an excellent question.
Which happened, or we think happened in this
Yes.
case. It was
Right.
turned off, whereas an image continued on radar
Yes.
without an identification. Go ahead.
Pilots generally like to be able to turn various pieces of equipment off if they need to. The reason is if there's an electrical fire and you need to isolate it, you need to be able to turn that particular device off. Imagine a toaster in your house that was hardwired and caught fire and you could not unplug it. So the transponder basically has a switch, and any person can turn that switch off. Now the transponder also has a backup. There's a number 1 transponder and a number 2 transponder. So if you were to lose one transponder, you would immediately switch to the secondary or backup transponder.
I actually heard one explanation this week that one reason that pilots do shut off the transponders after they've landed, and they do it as a courtesy
Yes.
to flight control. Explain, what's that?
Basically, if you take an airport with many aircraft on the ground, if they all have their transponders on, the radar screen would be clogged up with images of all these aircraft, or basically their transponder returns. So in order to filter out what is not necessary, we always turn our transponders off after we land, and we turn them on just as we take off.
All right, Dennis Hunkovic, let's bring you into this. You have flown Malaysian Airlines. You've been to Kuala Lumpur and beyond.
Yes.
What's it like to fly Malaysia Air?
Malaysia Air is like any other professional airline. I've really had no problems. They fly really good equipment. As a matter of fact, the KL, the Kuala Lumpur Airport, is probably one of the top 5 or 6 airports in the world. So I've found them to be very professional. They use either Airbus or Boeing equipment, and you should not be afraid to fly that airline.
Now, what's been going through your head? You just returned on a Boeing 777 from Asia, as we said, from Japan this past week. You've had, how many air miles you must have racked up over the years? You probably couldn't even compute if we gave you a week to do so.
Well, on one airline I have 1.3 million, so
okay,
I don't count the other ones.
You're like George Clooney.
Yeah, that's a pretty good start. So what was your reaction when you heard about this? What surprises you the most?
The only thing that surprised me was I have no fear about being on an airplane. I mean, the equipment today, whether it's Airbus or Boeing, I think is world class. What concerns me is the fact that the individuals who are flying the airplanes are really your greater risk than the planes themselves. And so if you worry about these kind of things, you never get on an airplane, and you and I think would agree that you have to fly everywhere. But you shouldn't be afraid to go out there. But at the end of the day, with the kind of people who can get onto airplanes today, we're talking probably here about the pilots, I would guess. Would you agree?
I agree.
Not someone who's going to, break in and say, I'm going to take over, because that would be a different kind of thing. I think you need to have more careful review of the pilots and the people who are actually up in the cockpit.
I agree.
Are there cultural differences that will make an investigation of what happened there very different than what would happen domestically?
That's a really good question. In a lot of countries of the world, it's very difficult for a person to take responsibility. And if something happens in your country, like Malaysia, they consider it to be a problem for the whole country. And so it seems to me that Malaysian Airlines was probably a little less forthcoming with information early on because they really wanted to check it out. I think in dealing in people, as you are both in the same business, full disclosure and transparency is really important. I think that's probably where they made a mistake.
Okay, well, here we are. We're speaking on Friday, but you're talking about the personnel flying an airplane. Now, that leads me to believe that you're saying that it was an inside job and someone has steered this plane to some place.
John, I have no idea. I'm
Right.
sitting next to a real expert on airplanes. I would defer to him. But from what little I have seen, this is something that whoever did it knew what they were doing. They were very sophisticated. It seemed to be planned. And that's not something that I think you can jump on an airplane and do. But I'd rather have a real expert talk
I
about
would
that.
like to comment on that.
Yeah, please.
Basically, we start with what we know. The transponder was shut off. Then we break it down into what are the reasons that could cause that to happen. Number 1, the internal unit failed itself. Number 2, there was a electrical emergency on board. If there was an electrical emergency on board, the transponder would probably be switched over to emergency power and wouldn't just be shut off. The second thing is the ACAR system was shut off at, I believe, 107.
But what's an ACAR system?
Okay, ACARS is another method where the aircraft communicates with the ground.
Okay.
And it automatically, in this case, it automatically sends out engine data. That's so the manufacturers can monitor the performance of the engine. And now the ACAR system does not have a button or a switch that you turn on and off. It has circuit breakers. Now, to make it even more interesting, the ACARS does not have one circuit breaker, it has usually two. One is accessible in the cockpit, the other one has to be accessed through the E&E compartment down below the cockpit, which you cannot reach from the air. It looks like, now it looks like, the ACAR system was disabled at 107. 14 minutes later, the transponder was shut off. But the ACAR system still continued to send engine data periodically because the second circuit breaker for the ACARs was not accessible by the person who may have disabled the first circuit breaker in the transponder.
So the comparison here would be to, say, TWA 800 in 1996 when it was the center field. There was an explosion, catastrophic event in an instant. The aircraft breaks apart. Clearly, the evidence indicates there was a sequence of events, not a single catastrophic incident.
Or does it remind you of the Egypt Air from 1999, where it really looks like the pilot?
Yep. He just took it
down.
Yeah.
We just have about a minute to go in this segment. Legal issues that come to your mind as an attorney.
There are really two things. There's a thing called the Montreal Convention, which limits the maximum amount of money that you can receive if you were a passenger, or your family could if you were killed. But you don't get that amount of money unless you sue in a certain kind of court. That's like a ceiling. The second thing is, aside from that, which the airline would pay to you, you have the right to sue the manufacturer. In this case, it would be Boeing, saying there was a problem with the airplane. The 427 flight that happened here about 20 years ago, there were some problems with the Boeing airplane. But in this case, it's too early to say, but it's possible that Boeing can be sued down the line, but we don't know.
All right, you mentioned U.S. Air Flight 427. Our next guest, John Gismondi, will join us in a moment and share his thoughts. He was intimately involved with that investigation and with some of the liability issues there. More on the KDPG Sunday edition in just a moment.
Schneider Downs, Wealth Management Advisors, advice-driven 401k plans.
Hi, I'm Katie McGinty, and I'm running for governor. Coming to you direct with a little help from my iPhone.